President of a great democracy such as ours, and the editors of great newspapers such as yours, owe a common obligation to the people, an obligation to present the facts, to present them with candor, and to present them in perspective. It is with that obligation in mind that I have decided in the last 24 hours to discuss briefly at this time the recent events in Cuba. On that unhappy island, as in so many other arenas of the contest for freedom, the news has grown worse instead of better. I have emphasized before that this was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator.
Dwight D. Eisenhower, the President of the United States before Kennedy, was the person who authorized the training of the exiles in Guatemala. Most of the recruits were from Miami and were exiles who had been forced to leave their country by Castro and his military forces. The exiles were put on planes and flown to Guatemala to be trained for the invasion. Many Cubans were trained as pilots to bomb Castro's army encampments and air bases. The Trinidad Plan was the first plan created by guerrilla warfare specialists. The plan was to land near the town of Trinidad, which was an anti-Castro part of Cuba. There the exiles would recruit people from the town to help them fight. Finally, they would move into the mountains surrounding the city and meet up with the anti-Castro guerrillas. Kennedy then rejected the plan because it was too open of an area, and he believed Castro and the rest of the world would know the U.S. was involved in helping with the invasion. The exiles were trained to use many kinds of weapons and explosives to prepare for the invasion. After all this training, the exiles were ready to conduct the invasion. The beginning of the invasion started before the land invasion, in which the exile pilots flew over Castro's encampments and attempted to destroy them. After a couple of tries, the exile planes were being shot down by Castro's fighters, and the exiles believed the United States military was sending them on suicide missions. They then demanded that the U.S. pilots fly with them. The bombing runs were a disaster, and they really did not help the exiles during the land invasion. The land invasion started on April 17, 1961. By April 19th, the invasion had failed, and Castro had captured the exiles. The invasion took place in Cuba in a small divot in the country that was surrounded by swamps. The beach had wild boars living on it and had shark-infested waters. The landing crafts used were from World War II and were not in the best condition. Castro's forces largely outnumbered the exiles. There were 1,500 exiles in total. If the Trinidad Plan had been used, there would have been at least 3,000 rebel forces. Castro's army had been thousands and thousands of men and hundreds of tanks and planes. They killed or captured the exiles very easily, and the invasion had ended in 48 hours. Castro's forces also used artillery to force the exiles off of the beach and to fortify the leaders' defensive positions. After the capture of the exiles, Castro's men ransacked their encampment and took their supplies. The exile prisoners were marched to large holding pens like gyms and stadiums. The United States and the Kennedy administration paid Castro to release all of the exiles. Castro took the money and supplies and allowed the exiles to go back to the United States. Most of the exiles went back to Miami and were very unhappy with Kennedy. The Bay Pigs hung over Kennedy and his administration for the rest of their time in office, made Kennedy look really bad, and forced him to reconsider his advisors and his treatment of communist countries and leaders. Before the invasion, Castro was satisfied to lead his socialist military government and isolate himself from the rest of the world. Nikita Khrushchev was the leader of the Communist Soviet Union at the time of the Bay Pigs invasion, and he was always looking to extend communism to the rest of the world. As a result of the Bay Pigs invasion, the Soviet Union looked to create a treaty with Castro and Cuba. Even though the invasion only lasted for 48 hours, it was felt around the world and throughout the Cold War for the next 30 years. The Bay Pigs invasion led directly to the Cuban Missile Crisis because of the new relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union, and more importantly, the relationship between Castro and Khrushchev. This crisis led the Soviets to believe that Kennedy was a weak leader and that he was not as much as a threat as they previously thought. The Bay Pigs invasion is still remembered today because it has changed how the world and the U.S. deal with other countries in certain crises.